This is a bit of an emergency stream because apparently, during my first stream of the original my words white article, my audio cut out like halfway through the stream, and then just no one said anything, and I didn't realize why everyone was leaving the stream until I finished it, and then someone was like, I like was like, your thing was so lazy, you just like recorded the first 30 minutes, stopped, and then played in MTG Arena, and I was like, what are you talking about? And then I double checked and realized that the stream just cut out. So I'm just going to have to re-record this. It's not going to be as much talking as with the original article, because I already talked about it and I probably mentioned it in some of the other colors. And this is just going to be like a proper reading to make sure it's like up there. So let's just get into it. My words white, making magic, May 19th, 2025. Mark Rosewater. Hello everyone, this is the color white from Magic the Gathering. As regular readers are aware, Mr. Rosewater is a huge fan of Magic's color pie, having extensively written and talked about it. Many years ago, he was kind enough to let each of the colors of Magic appear on his podcast, Drive to Work, to talk about ourselves, our core philosophies, and how we see the world, including the other colors of Magic. He is providing us each a Making Magic article to do the same. Today, I will be your guest writer, and I believe you will hear and I believe you'll hear from the other four colors of Magic before the end of the year. To explain my philosophy, I'd like to begin to take a step back, looking at the world as a whole. There are a lot of problems. There is crime, injustice, hunger, disease, just an endless amount of suffering, but here is the important thing. There does not have to be. I will use hunger as an example. There is enough food for everyone. Starvation happens not because we do not have the means to feed people, but because people prioritize things like over the welfare of others. So, as I mentioned before, Mark has like a collection of cards that he shows. It's usually in relation to whatever he's talking about or about to talk about. So let's just look at some of the cards here so we have a better idea of what's going on. Cat Collector, 2 generic, 1 white. Creature, human, citizen. When this creature enters, create a food token. Whenever you gain life the first time during each of your turns, create a 1/1 cat creature token. Why so many? Because they need a home, just like I once did. So Mark right here is talking about food, right? So he immediately uses the Cat Collector as an example, something that creates food, which in theory I guess is to feed the cats. But also just taking care of the cats. And one thing mechanically white gets a lot of is like gaining life, which just represents white wanting to help people. The idea that a white aligned creature is likely to want to help you, and that's put in the work to heal you or heal each other, or put +1/+1 counters and stuff like that. One thing I also think is fascinating with the color pie in Magic is how the mechanics encourage you to think, kind of put yourself in the shoes of that color. So, for example, blue wants to usually play very slow, very methodically. It wants you to think about what you're doing, gain as much information as possible. So how's that represented in gameplay? Well, blue tends to play kind of slow, either controller tempo, and you tend to have a lot of card draws, so it gains as much information as possible. And blue doesn't have like a lot of direct like destroying effects, so blue wants you to play smart, right? Blue wants you to be clever, to bounce things, to stall for time, so you can look for even more information, stuff like that. And this way, white is similar. White doesn't want you to put emphasis. White wants you to put emphasis on the group, not like any one individual or put all your power into one person or raise the individual but the group. In order to do that, what white does is it has low power and toughness to encourage you to go wide and have as many creatures as possible. And not to mention that a lot of white's buffy mechanics, while white is really good at putting +1/+1 counters on stuff, when it comes to like temporary buffs or certain buffs, it doesn't really get like a lot of +3/+3 effects. For example, it gets like +2/+2 +1/+1, but it tends to apply them to a wider group, like all your creatures or some of your creatures. So you're rewarded it becomes more powerful, more potent the more creatures you have, and it encourages you to go wide doing that. Part of the reason I mentioned power and toughness too is because I think people take power and toughness very literally sometimes. And sometimes, to be fair, that power and toughness is just like a limitations of the game. So like having 10 squirrels that can beat like a primeval like nigh godlike entity embodiment of Alara. What's So there's the joke that like 10 squirrels can beat Progenitus, or I guess Progenitus is protection from everything, but you know what I mean. Like 10 squirrels can beat Fusion Elemental or whatever. Um and part of that is just like a limitation of how like Magic the Gathering as a game, like as quantifying power and strength. But some of that is also like more metaphorical. Like there's like the joke that like a 2/2 pig can beat like a well trained soldier with like a sword. And well, first of all, boards can be quite vicious. But second of all, the point there is that the soldier is trying to encourage you to go wide. The soldier is saying, I work at my best when I'm with other people, and I want you to use me in combination with as many other people as possible. I don't want to work alone. That is what the soldier token slash card is trying to communicate. It's saying you should not rely solely on like a soldier by themselves. Because like the point is that you want an army or a group, something like that. Um Grand Crescendo. X generic, 2 white. Instant. Create X 1/1 green and white persistent creature tokens. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. The War of Applause drowned out the melee raging in the lobby. So once again, just going white. I mean, going wide. Blah. And it also gives creatures indestructible, which is something that white also gets. Just the idea that it wants to help people and wants to protect people in various ways so they can't be killed or destroyed. Happily Ever After. 2 generic, 1 white. Enchantment. When Happily Ever After enters the battlefield, each player gains 5 life and draws a card. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 5 or more colors among permanents you control, there are 6 or more card types among permanents you control, and or cards in your graveyard, and your life total is greater than the it's a lot, or equal to the amount of your starting life total, you win the game. So white, once again, example of life gain, the idea of helping you, but also draw. So white tends to be more limited in how it can draw cards. Blue can basically draw cards almost however it wants. Black usually requires some sort of extra cost to draw a card. You have to sacrifice a creature or pay life or something. Red has impulse draw, where it can exile something so you can play it before like the turn or next turn ends. It also has like looting effects where you discard a card and draw a card. But white is more limited in that it tends to either draw. Also, green can draw a lot of cards, but it tends to be based on creatures. So green can't. So this idea that like, green can just draw cards any way it wants. So currently, how green works is, as Mike Mark has and people have stated, is that green is reliant on creatures. So green wants to draw cards just to care about creatures into the battlefield or have a creature that like attacks or something. Green cannot draw cards without creatures generally. But with white's card draw is either a catch-up effect where it's like a player is ahead of you, so playing into white's team with fairness and equality, you can draw a card to try to catch up with the player like who has more cards in hand than you, or it's draw 1 card at a time. And white is next to blue, so it does like care about like a sort of emphasis on knowledge and being methodical when possible. But I assume being able to draw 1 card at a time per instance is like leaning to the idea that white can be a little inflexible, that white can have a very rigid, overly strict morality, and that's sort of the critique it's going with, like the idea that white might be less likely to accept or embrace certain things because it goes against its like really black and white, strict, morally rigid worldview. Also, my audio cuts out again. Feel free to tell me. So I think it's what I was trying to kind of represent. It also helps play into white being like slow, kind of like a slow color, like it wants to gather its forces and think about what it's doing very carefully. The rest of stuff I think is more just like here is more the flavor of this specific card, which is like all the realms coming together. But there is this idea that potentially with white here in this instance of like everybody has a place in society and everyone can make themselves useful in a certain way. So there's that too. Resistance Reunited. 1 generic, 1 white. Instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Equipped creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes, said Koth. I was about to say the same, my friend, Elspeth replied. So once again, like I said, white usually does get buffs, but they're usually like on the smaller side. So +2/+2, +1/+1, not really +3/+3s, and indestructible for protection to keep people alive. United Battlefront. 3 generic, 1 white. Sorcery. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. Put up to 2 non-creature, non-land permanents with mana value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. The Abzan forces rally to the call, driving back Sarkhan's Feral Dragon Horde. So this is an example. This doesn't have creatures in it because it's non-creature, non-land permanents. So white does care about enchantments, and the reason that's more metaphorical. Enchantments can do a good job representing, for example, laws, which are like non-physical things that hold effects, or just like persistent magical effects that white may use to enforce law within a certain area, or some like higher concept like morality or like the soul, stuff that like may not always be something you can physically interact with. White also tends about care about artifacts. I don't have as a strong a reason about why white in particular cares about artifacts sometimes, other than the fact that I guess it's allies with blue, but also the fact that artifacts can be used to help people. Technology can be used to make the world a better place. So if people are suffering, you don't need to just sit there and let them suffer. You can invent something that helps people live an easier life and get the resources they need. And white tends to have like cares about mana, like low mana values or low power and toughness, just because it's the idea that it wants you to go wide. Once again, it likes to play like a lot of small things that go wide to play into the idea that white cares about the good of the group. We can live in a world where everyone gets things they need. No one needs to go hungry. No one needs to be without shelter. No one needs to be lonely. No one needs to exist in fear. No one needs to live a life of pain and suffering. There exists the possibility that the whole world can live in peace. Take a moment to let that sink in. Most suffering happens because we choose not to stop it, but we can. The potential for a utopia is real. We have the means to get there. So, one of the phrases Mark has like a little key phrase for each color to help get the gist of their idea, like their philosophy across. And in the case of white, that is usually peace through structure, which is it's white's goal of like peace and, everyone having what they need, and through structure, which is, laws, morality, even religion sometimes, stuff like that. And here is the best part. It only requires us to make one change. I'll acknowledge that it is a big change, but it is a doable one. We simply must learn how to put the needs of a group ahead of our own personal needs. Instead of asking, what do I want? We must learn to ask, what does the group need? If each person thinks about the needs of the group and acts accordingly, we can create a utopia where everyone has their basic needs met. No hunger, no crime, no suffering. So why is everyone not doing this? This is because the motivations of people naturally come from an internal place. Your emotions, your physical drives, your instincts come from within. They are focused on what you, the individual, want. If you are hungry, you desire food for yourself. People do naturally have things like empathy, but that needs to be nurtured. The concept that other people have problems that you can act to alleviate is something that has to be learned. That is the big challenge. People, when left to their own devices, will inherently act selfishly. This is actually kind of funny because black and white are enemies, and in this article and Black's article, you see them sort of like railing on each other a bit. But here, black and white actually do agree on something generally, which is that like people will act inherently selfishly. But where the philosophy differs is like what you think they think you should do about it. Where black is like we should lead into it, and white's like we can change that. We can get people to act selflessly, not out of ill will, but simply because it is the path of least resistance. The temptation to do things that will benefit you is strong. That is the conflict we are up against. But there is good news. People inherently want to help one another. There is a natural goodness within each of us that seeks to help others. I admit it is more apparent in some individuals than others, but it is there in all of us, and you can witness it if you look around your community. Caretaker's talent. 2 generic, 1 white. Enchantment class. Whenever one or more tokens you control enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So we are talking about the card draw, but also caring about tokens going wide. 1 white. When this class becomes level 2, create a token that's a copy of target token you control. So white sometimes can make copies of creatures. Not as often as blue and red, and usually it's specifically its own creatures. But the idea, of course, is that it's going wide, and it can conjure or summon more people to help the team work together. And this also, I guess, this idea of like white wants to treat everyone equally. So it's this idea of like spreading out talent and teaching other people the same talent, so they each have a role. 3 generic, 1 white. Creature tokens you control get +2/+2. Guide of Souls, 1 white. Creature, human, cleric. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and get 1 energy, an energy counter. Whenever you attack, you may pay 3 energy. When you do, put up +2/+1/+1 counter and put 2/+1/+1 counters and a flying counter on target attacking creature. It becomes an angel in addition to its other types. So a couple things going on here. We don't talk about life gain. I don't really think I need to explain energy because it's just like an alternate source to pay for stuff. But white, of course, cares about +1/+1 counters as a way of bolstering and healing people within the game. There in Magic used to have a lot more like effects that say like remove all the damage from from the X creature or whatever. It doesn't really usually do that as often anymore. But one of the ways that it sometimes uses one of the things it sometimes uses as a metaphor for healing within the game as a mechanic is +1/+1 counters. Because if you have like 2 damage on you, put a +1/+1 counter. Technically, you can take more damage. Of course, white also gets a lot of flyers. It's kind of hard to like think of like I guess in the case of white, it gets a lot of flying because it represents the idea of wanting to keep its people safe. So it gives them more ways to traverse through like danger safely. And this can be seen not only in flying, but also like how it can grant protection from like colors, which also prevents them from being blocked and allows you to swing in without having to worry about your thing is getting hurt in most cases. And white also gets angels as a creature type. So angels are, I think they're an iconic creature type, I believe. There's the characteristic creature types and iconic. Trying to look for the actual MTG wiki. Where's the like the Scry? There's like a Scryfall Red MTG wiki, but they are it's a characteristic. They're the iconic ones. So each color has like a characteristic human, like a characteristic creature type, which is like usually smaller human, merfolk, vampire slash zombie, goblin, elf, and then the iconic, which are like the big heavy hitters that like kind of make you go wow when you open a pack. In the case of in the case, and I think they're all picked for a reason. In the case with angels, I think it's pretty obvious. In that they are picked because angels have a strong association with like objective morality and the idea that they are serving some sort of moral god or objective moral code of some sort, or act as a messenger for such a being. Um, and they tend to be just to be associated with purity and goodness, which colors like black will say objective morality does not exist. But the point is that's from like White's perspective, right? So from White's perspective, it's gonna heavily like the idea of like angels as a concept, like this inherently morally good and pure being that acts as a messenger for some other greater good to lead people in the right direction. Um, but where is? Sorry, I'm trying to find Magic. Is there Magic the Gathering? Okay. Scryfall. See, there's mtg.wiki. Oh, moving to a new domain. Okay, well, there's mtg.wiki. But anyway, so this idea of becoming like that sort of embodiment of an angel or whatever. Keeper of the Accord, 3 generic, 1 white. Creature, human, soldier. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more creatures than you, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more lands than you may search your library for a basic plants card, put onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So once again, I touched on this with card draw, but white has this sort of theme of like fairness and equality and balance. This is mostly done in Commander and with Commander cards as opposed to standard sets in most cases, but it's still there with this idea that if an opponent is ahead, you can catch up because you're trying to equal the playing field or make things fair, like a fair fight or an even fight. And this also applies to lands. So all the colors can actually search for their own basic land to an extent. They're usually like more limited if you're not green or sometimes red. But in the case of white, it can usually play extra lands if somebody else is ahead. So that way, it's like a way to like catch up and equalize things. Sheriff of the Safe Passage. 2 generic, 1 white. Creature, human, knight. Kind of weird that it chose to make the Cowboys knights. I mean, I get it like broadly, like archetypically, I suppose, but Sheriff of Safe Passage enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it, with plus an additional +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature you control. Plot: 1 generic, 1 white. So once again, it's just the idea that it's rewarding you for having a bunch of creatures on the field, and the more creatures you have in the field, the harder it fights, or just the more powerful it is. Wizened Mentor. 1 generic, 1 white. Creature, zombie, cleric. So it's actually interesting getting a zombie here. Most zombies tend to be black, but on planes like Amonkhet, sometimes creatures are different colors than what they usually are. So in this case, it's white and black. I mean, on Amonkhet, zombies are white and black, but in this specific case, it's just a mono white zombie. Whenever an opponent activates an ability of a permanent that isn't a mana ability, you create a 1/1 white zombie creature token. That ability triggers only once each turn. It wasn't that his students were better; it was that his students had made him better. So here's this idea of white. Like one thing White's really good at doing in Magic is setting rules. And here's an example of that in like a more simplified way, where it's like, hey, you're following my rules, so don't activate, the ability of a permanent. And if you do, I see it as a threat, so I create an extra token to help fight that threat. We can get more into like why zombies are white on Amonkhet specifically another time, but I think it's just more tied to like like Egyptian mythology and how like mummies were seen as like a sort of holy thing to do. And on the plane of Amonkhet specifically, there is a curse that causes people, if you just leave a dead body, it will come back as like a zombie anyway. So the idea of what is desecrating a body, what is respecting it on that plane is going to be different than like in our world or in a lot of other planes. So I guess in the case of Amonkhet, making sure it's like a nice zombie or a zombie that's, doing its job properly is honoring the dead as opposed to just letting it wander around as a shallow husk of what it once was. But how do we get from where we were to where we were to where we need to be? First, people need guidance. People will do the right thing if you nudge them in the right direction. How do we do that? The answer is simple: structure. Humans are creatures of habit. If you can provide the incentives to act correctly, they will. And they will continue to repeat those behaviors, and they'll continue to repeat those behaviors. That is the key. We have to create a society where helping one another is core to how it is built. In addition, we need to provide incentives, both positive and negative. If one does the right thing, they get a reward. People need personal connection. If you do what you are supposed to do, you become a valued member of the community. You become a part of something larger than yourself, something that provides companionship and positive reinforcement. Also, hold on, I just realized I gotta check something. I do need to make sure none of my other videos were bloody corrupted. I know this is probably unprofessional, but I'm trying to figure out how much work I would need to do to correct that. Live. Make sure everything's working. That's nature being nature. And my audience will be on the wrong source. You can see the bias. The flavor being that, like, tapped and attacking. So once again, so that's all there. Okay. So it's just white. My worst nightmare is that I recorded all those videos in the colors, and then all of them like only had like the first 30 minutes. I don't know what's up with my mic. I think it's the wire, but sometimes it just stops working. Cast out. 3 generic, 1 white. Enchantment. Flash. When this enchantment enters. So here's like the incentive. So we're talking about positive and negative incentive. So this idea of with green and white, they're like hippie colors all the time, and that can be white and green, but it's not always the case. In the case of green, it's important to remember that nature is not necessarily inherently peaceful. Things die and get eaten all the time, and that's just like a part of life. So it's like, green's not always saying like you shouldn't fight or there shouldn't be violence. And in the case of white is like sometimes you got to make the calls in order to get people to behave correctly. So sometimes you do have to use violence against someone to, for example, white can destroy attacking or blocking creatures. Like a creature is doing something you don't want them to do, they're threatening to hurt you, you can destroy them or cast them out or whatever. So here we see like examples of white using like sort of rules kind of to get people to behave in a way that's better for the good of the group. So here we have cast out, 3 generic, 1 white. Enchantment. Flash. When this enchantment enters, exile target non-land permanent. An opponent controls until this enchantment leaves the battlefield. So this is like an Oblivion Ring effect, which is just an effect that says exile target creature until the permanent that did the exiling leaves the battlefield. And this represents sort of like the idea of like not killing something, but imprisoning it or otherwise punishing it so it can't hurt anyone else. Excommunicate. 2 generic, 1 white. Sorcery. Puts our creature on top of its owner's library. Our law prohibits capital punishment. We believe even the greatest offenders have the chance to redeem themselves. Torian Shaw, Soul Warden. So this is actually kind of a pretty interesting white card because it can bounce any creature, which makes sense in white. White does sometimes get creature bounce, but it's usually bouncing its own stuff. In the case of bouncing its own stuff, it's the idea of protecting it. Like if someone casts a spell to target a white creature, you can cast your own white spell to bounce it and save it. Or otherwise kind of like remove damage or counters on it, for example. So bouncing can also act as a form of healing. So if he has like -1/-1 counters on it, you can bounce a creature you control and then replay it so it has no counters on it again. In this case, it's meant to be used mostly probably on your opponents. And the idea is that you're like, it's kind of like in a similar vibes like cast out, where it's like you're imprisoning the creature or like stalling for time until it learns its lesson. Ghostly Prison. 2 generic, 1 white. Enchantment. Creatures can't attack unless their controller plays 2 generic for each creature they control that's attacking you. May the memory of our fallen heroes ensnare the violent hearts of lesser men. Great Threshold of Monstercrat Inscription. So here we have another good example of white's rule setting, where it's like making a new rule that people like either opponents have to follow or everyone has to follow. And here's like the idea is that like creatures it helps prevent people from hurting each other. Like if creatures want to attack, they have to pay extra. It's sort of like kind of like how you might pay a fine, like if you get a charge of like battery or something, you have to pay a fine sometimes. It's kind of like in that same vein. Palace Jailer. 2 generic, 2 white. Creature, human soldier. When Palace Jailer enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. When Palace Jailer enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until an opponent becomes monarch. So once again, this is just exiling, and the idea that you follows the say of the king or whatever, the king or queen or the monarch. So it's in the same vein as cast out, except there's like a little bit of extra flavor there with the idea that they're the jailer is like, I am bound to listen to whoever is in charge. Thraben Inspector, one white creature, human soldier. When Thraben Inspector enters the battlefield, investigate. Create a clue token. It's an artifact with two generic. Sacrifice this artifact. Draw a card. If you've ever been at this as long as I have, nothing can surprise you. That's the hope, at least. So once again, we have Thraben Inspector, which probably would have been a detective if it came out more recently. But there's this idea of white does have like a strong connection with detectives as a creature type, and certain like forms of investigate, because it's the idea that like white cares about truth because truth can help people do the right thing. Because it's because if someone's lying or hiding what they're doing, that means they can do like stuff that's bad for the group and then pretend like they're doing the right thing, which is overall going to hurt the group. So white cares about honesty in this sense because honesty means I can be sure that you're doing the right thing. And watching people can act as an incentive to get people to do the right thing and behave in the name of the good of the group. And I believe last time I did look it up, there are actually most detectives are, I believe, are white and blue. Blue also gets a lot of detectives, but in the case of blue, I think it's more like the idea that blue cares about information and knowledge and understanding, and it does care about truth in its own way. Maybe less for like, objective morality reasons, but more so for like it wants to find the truth so it can understand what's happening and help society become a better place. But if you look, these all different prints. Sorry. But they're all like they're on all different colors. But most detectives seem kind of like blue and white for the most part. You do get like a lot of detectives in a lot of other colors, but blue and white seems to be the majority. Yeah. So also, once again, I mentioned card draw, so it's important to mention that when I say white can usually only draw one card at a time, outside of specific circumstances, people think that like, oh, white can only draw one card per turn or something. Even though Mark and the designers made it very clear that what they're saying is that white can only draw one card per instance. So investigate is in mechanical color pie for white because it's each one only draws one card by default. But if you have like three investigate tokens and you sacrifice them all, you can draw 3 cards a turn. And the same goes with other certain like white effects, is you can draw multiple cards a turn if you stack them in the right way. If one does the wrong thing, they get punished. Maybe you lose some of your resources like money, so like paying mana or treasure. If it is serious enough, you can lose your freedom and be locked away. In addition, you can be shunned by the community. People react to incentives. Inherently, people want to belong. Peer pressure is powerful. That's one thing that I think white and black actually do overlap on, is like the idea of like incentives and also personal incentives, but also like the use of force in a way to get people to stay in line. The two biggest dangers to our plans are selfishness and recklessness. In regards to the first, people act out of self-interest either because they do not care about others or because they are unaware of how their actions affect others. Both are dangerous. The most useful tool to tackle selfishness is morality. You have to teach people that there is an objective right and an objective wrong. If you do right, you are good. If you do wrong, you are evil. There are rewards for being good and punishments for being evil. Also, so they say the two biggest dangers to our plans are selfishness and recklessness. This is a reference to black, which is all about putting the individual first and thus leans more to selfishness, and red, which is like recklessness, which is the idea of acting on your emotions as much as possible and thus maybe not thinking things all the way through. Part of this relationship is how you are taught to feel about yourself. By doing good things, you get to feel proud of yourself. If you do evil things, you are taught to feel bad about yourself. Again, good people get to become part of the community and evil people are shunned from it. In the long term, good people should receive the incentive of an ultimate reward, while evil people should receive the threat of a punishment. This is most often expressed through religion. So this is why, for example, white can have such a strong religious theme within Magic the Gathering. It's the idea that it's the idea of using religion as a tool to keep people in line. There's also like the idea that because when you talk about things like morality, it becomes very like non-physical and like more high-minded in certain ways. So the idea of like a soul, for example, can be very white, because the idea that if you do something evil, it may not hurt you physically, and in fact, it may feel great physically or even benefit you physically, but it could hurt your soul or like some sort of non-physical aspect of yourself, your conscious, stuff like that. I know that in a vacuum this may sound harsh, but if you want to influence behavior, it is important that you strongly communicate what is expected of your society. Again, a lot is on the line. One path leads to peace, the other suffering. Each rule that is broken means someone is hurt. If we have to take a heavy hand to ensure peace, to ensure that people can live a life without suffering, it is what has to be done. We are fighting a lot of powerful forces, so our messages have to be loud and clear. And once again, we kind of have like lean to potentially what might be more negative aspects of white or takes on it, which is the idea that might be a little bit too controlling sometimes. That every single rule matters, and that because of that, you can't. There's very little to no flexibility. Um. So because like in reality, when you actually think about like not every rule exists for completely benevolent reasons. So this adherence to the idea that each rule that's broken is like a moral wrongdoing can easily become a bad thing or an overcorrection. And so one thing I talk about as I want to also clarify is that white can be like rebellious or have themes of rebellion. I think people sometimes have this idea that like, oh, black and red are the colors of rebellion. They're out for the man. And it's important to understand that all the colors can rebel, but they will all just have their different reasons for doing so. And that black and red can be just as much of a like black can be just as much of an oppressive force as white, just for different reasons though. Um so like for example, black is all about getting as much power for yourself as possible, right? So you could an aristocrat who's willing to stomp on like on the weak and the vulnerable just to grab at more power so no one can stop them. That can be a very black line character. And that's not like a rebellious or character who sticks up like the little man, right? And I guess that what it breaks down is people just think that white is like inherently a fascist color. And I'm not saying like white can't easily play into that with certain like ideas or themes, but I also think that like white isn't inherently always just like rebellion is bad. White can find rebellion a morally just thing to do. Um, so here I even wrote a little bit about that, which I still got to update the grammar, so sorry for any grammatical errors, but I wrote a little bit about that just to explain the key differences here. I've seen a lot of talk about white as a villain, as a form of pushback and rebuttal against the idea that white is always the good guy. I think this is all well and good, but this does end up coming with its own misconceptions. The two most common I see are that colors like black and red are rebel and underdog colors, while white is the oppressor, and that white does not care about individual people at all. Firstly, while white is a philosophy that can easily encourage oppression, it can also easily be the philosophy of rebellion. To begin with, black is a color philosophy that can easily encourage just as much oppression as white, but for different reasons. Black argues that you should prop yourself up and gain as much power as possible. If this requires you to step on the downtrodden, plebs, or persecuted, so be it. If it requires you to use bribes or leverage your social/economic status against people, then so be it. Black is totally willing to use laws to keep its power if it knows people will listen. And here are some examples I show from within Magic and Autocrat. So here we have some, especially Orzhov cards. Like Orzhov are a good example of white and black coming together, and you as like a sort of oppressive force. And I think that it does a good job reflecting like aspects of both of them in a way. And how like black is just as willing to use laws as white is to restrict people or stop to stay in power. Plus, if you've read the article so far, you should know that one of the things white cares about the most due to its beliefs in moral objectivism is justice, fairness, doing the right thing, and equality. If white believes a group is being mistreated or unfairly hurt, it is going to try to help them. Not to mention that if white believes the rebels are in the moral right, it is going to want to side with them. Ultimately, white philosophy encourages sticking up for the unfairly treated just as much, honestly more than, red or black does, because it believes everyone should be treated fairly, putting others first and moral things like potentially basic human rights, since it believes some moral lines shouldn't be crossed. White is also a philosophy that argues you should always be trying to do the right thing. I guess the best way to describe it is that a black and or red rebel. Once again, the wording's weird here. So one of the best ways to describe it is that a black and or red rebel, due to their philosophy, would mean they're probably fighting on behalf of the individual and the individual freedom to do what you want. But white aligned rebels usually fight for justice, the many, the fairness, society, morality, etc. In essence, I think all three philosophies have a rebellion and stand up for the underdog theme, but the reasons for why they do so are different. And yeah, white does care about individual people. Honestly, weirdly, I think white cares more about individual people than like green, kinda, because green kind of believes like in that everyone has like their place in nature, or I guess not necessarily always nature, but like the world, and like has like a place within that system. And white is trying to save as many lives as possible, but green isn't always trying to do that. Green is like sometimes your place in the ecosystem is to get fucking eaten as like an elk or some shit. So like green isn't necessarily concerned about trying to save every individual life when it can. White leans more into trying to save every single like person when possible. Um so here we have like some good examples of like white aligned punishments. Rule of law. 2 generic, 1 white. Enchantment. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. The law is meant to ensure that people kill each other with only the utmost fairness. Well, I mean, but yeah. So another example of rule setting, the idea that you can't cast more than 1 spell each turn because that's like ultimate fairness, I suppose, in some way. Damning verdict. 3 generic, 2 white. Sorcery. Destroy all creatures with no counters on them. Guilty as charged. Um, so this is one thing that you sometimes see in white is that sometimes it will destroy all creatures. The idea of like because white is so heavy into leaning into like going wide, then it knows very well how to deal with other people who are trying to go wide, and thus will try to like wipe the board to prevent them from using their numbers to overwhelm white, or the idea that you can just build your board faster because you have more people than just trying to have one person who plays like a big creature every once in a while. Um, and Citywide Bust is another good example of both that, but also the fact that sometimes white has like conditional destruction. So black can basically destroy things with like just like by paying mana or sometimes life. It can destroy like creatures basically for free. White can destroy creatures, but it usually comes out of like a specific condition involved. So for example, Citywide Bust, 1 generic, 2 white, sorcery, destroy all creatures with toughness 4 or greater. Oh, you fellas are going to love the lockup. Excellent Gruul, very low ceiling. Labuse, Boros Sergeant. Also, once again, police brutality by the Boros. It's really fucked up. So just fuck prisoner rights, I guess. But so white, one thing that white gets a lot is like destroy target attacking creature, destroy target blocking creature, and destroy target creature with power or toughness 4 or greater. And the idea behind that, I think, is just that white sees something as a threat for whatever reason, and because of that, it thinks it's morally right to destroy it. But here it's like combined with like a board wipe effect. Azorius Arrestor, two generic, 1 white. Creature, human, soldier. The Azorius Arrestor enters the battlefield. When Azorius Arrestor enters the battlefield, detain target creature and opponent controls. Until your next turn, that creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. So once again, white sort of like restraining people, setting down new rules in place, even if only temporarily. Like for example, removing abilities, making you unable to use abilities. You can't attack or block, so you can't get in the way of justice or whatever. You have the right to remain silent, mostly because I'm tired of your excuses. Austere Command, 4 generic, 2 white. Sorcery, choose 2. Destroy all artifacts, destroy all enchantments, destroy all creatures with mana value 3 or less, destroy all creatures with mana value 4 or greater. So this is the idea of like a sort of like a board wipe, but also combined with the idea that white is like declaring something as like bad or evil, and you destroy anything that meets like that criteria. So certain creatures, certain enchantments, artifacts, etc. And once again, there's kind of like a sort of irony with certain colors where it's like because white plays into enchantments so much, it also gets the most tools to destroy and deal with enchantments because it understands how enchantments work flavor wise. Kind of like red does get enchantments sometimes, but it's the idea that red is very leans into emotion and just doing like the most direct thing possible most of the time. And because of that, red's like is gonna be less likely to have answers to enchantments because enchantments might not be something you can physically destroy or just like hit or there might be not be an immediately obvious way to destroy an enchantment. Like if you're impulsive and you see like a I don't know like a piece of art you don't like, you can just grab the art and destroy it, right? But if there's a law you don't like, it's way harder to like just undo the law. You can ignore it, but that doesn't mean the law isn't being enforced, and that doesn't mean other people are not going to enforce the law. The most useful tool to tackle recklessness is the law. The law presents a list of things you are not allowed to do because they endanger society. If you commit one of these acts, there is a punishment of proper weight. The greater the threat to society, the larger the punishment. It is important that these rules are public and clear. They delineate from what you can do. They delineate from what you can do and cannot do. Like morality, there should not be gray areas in these rules. Also, as with morality, you need to teach the public that breaking these rules lead to consequences. So I want to point out though that this is like exploring like the colors and some of their negative downsides. So this is a good example of like how white can be a little bit too black and white or strict or inflexible. But I do think you can have a white line character that has like certain gray areas, even if they do have an objective morality. And I think you can have like a white character who understands like the nuance of like why certain laws exist and when to break them. I think this is just a specific example that Mark is using to get an idea across. But what about people accidentally getting caught up in the system? What if someone does something wrong, but for an important reason? Perhaps someone kills another, but I like how I just said that, but Mark immediately addresses what I just said. What if someone does something wrong, but for an important reason? Perhaps someone kills another, but only in self-defense. This is where you get a judicial system. People can judge the circumstances to make sure that people are not punished incorrectly. Both systems come at a large cost, but have a great impact. They provide jobs, create a sense of safety, build community, and push toward our goal. Speaking of jobs, an important part of creating a society where people can look out for the group is making sure that everyone has their place in society. Clergy members, police, judges, politicians, and public servants all get roles people can take to help the group. In addition, there might be others outside your group that have ill will toward your society. That is why you need a military, to provide someone who can protect against those who wish your society ill. So that's one thing that also like white also gets a lot of within the game of Magic the Gathering is a lot of soldiers, a lot of military theme, and the idea of like people coming because most of that there's a bit of like discipline and like self defense, but most of that is because like the idea of military as being like um a bunch of soldiers coming together to achieve something that they could not achieve alone. So like one individual soldier can only do so much, but by uniting in a sort of organized military force, you can do something that any one person could not do alone and help like fight for good or whatever. I'm not always good, but I'm assuming this is what white means in this context. Red also has a big military theme, if you notice, and then in case of red, it's more like the idea of emotion and thus being willing to fight for what you believe in or what you want. I think I probably have it. I've talked about that a little bit here. Blah, 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 blah. Soldier, 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 soldier. Okay. A common white and red theme you see explored in Magic is that of military or armies, which is something that actually highlights another philosophical agreement between the colors. Unlike black, red is not saying you should always put yourself first. And while it usually won't just help people it doesn't emotionally connect to for no reason, red can still encourage an extreme passion or loyalty to a person, group, or cause in the same way. White in the same way white might have for religion, morality groups, or causes. Red and white also both advocate for being willing to fight for others you care about, even if it might put you in danger. This means that despite being enemy colors, red and white both understand and tend to like to use tactics that involve masses of people. In red, this tends to manifest as a giant rioting emotional mob, while white usually prefers more disciplined groups that have people making them that have the people making them up strategically work together. So and then you see that come together, kind of like the idea of like passion, but also order, and like aggression, but also discipline. White and red are both also philosophies that can encourage or uphold loyalty a lot of the time. I guess I should say like they can encourage blind loyalty. Like colors like black and want you to put yourself first, and blue wants you to like kind of question everything to an extent. White and red are both colors that are like you don't always need to ask questions. Like just follow your heart, right? Do what you feel or know is right. White and red are philosophies that can encourage or uphold loyalty a lot of the time. Red's loyalty is more likely to be on a whim due to being emotion based, but it can encourage being extremely loyal to its friends, family, and or groups. So that's that. This is one of the strengths of a community. When each component piece comes together, all of them prioritize the needs of the group. You can create something stronger than the sum of its parts. This is one of the greatest weapons we have against our enemies. I should stress that ideally we would exist in a world where we have no enemies, where everyone in the whole world is working together for a shared vision. But sometimes on the path to that vision, we will have to build smaller groups. The hope is that our ideals will spread with time as others see the fruits of our action. The combination of morality and law is important because it gives depth to your message. You should not kill for two reasons. First, it is morally wrong. Second, it is against the law. So this is kind of like a comment against like black and red. It's a kind of like a shot at them. It's important to understand that like because I'm reading an article from White's perspective, there's gonna be like a bit of red and black slander. So if you feel like it's not like a fair take on black and red, it's kind of the point of the articles like this. And I already recorded the in words black article by Mark if you want to read that. But just know that like this, like do not base your entire opinion of what black and red believe in or are doing solely on like what white believes is they are doing in this article. This means there are all sorts of repercussions. These disincentives can be physical, you will go to jail, emotional, people will shun you, or spiritual, you'll be punished in your afterlife. Different people will prioritize different incentives. So the breadth of response will help you motivate a wide variety of people. So Mark swaps the order of these here, where he talks about the color after he shows the cards here. So I'm gonna read the how white feels towards other colors first, and then talk about the cards. But let me get a drink of water. Okay, let me spend a little time talking about my fellow magic colors. I will start with one of my allies, blue. Blue and I share a love of civilization. If you want your society to work at its best, you need to create systems to do so. Blue loves making systems. The more intricate, the better, and is motivated to optimize how things work. Blue likes thinking things through and planning. Blue wants to make society the best version of itself that it can be. That is all music to my ears. That is the same motivation I have for creating the structure I just talked about. Now, blue cares a lot more about the civic side of things, government, law, the courts, than the moral side. So this is like a pretty good actually distinction a little bit, where because blue is like next to black, blue has like less of like strict morality than white tends to have, and because of that, the reason why blue tends to do or not do things is more like crunching the numbers kind of reasons. Like, oh, you shouldn't burn these books because that's precious information. Where white might say you shouldn't burn those books because that's like morally wrong, or that's against the law, or that's desecration. So blue's gonna have more like the reason you shouldn't do something is because it makes things harder to improve, or it doesn't improve things. Um, where white is sometimes gonna have like less questioning about why you're doing things. Like blue's gonna emphasize more like you should question why you're doing something and why you should or shouldn't do it. And thus, if you think it's like not, if you think there's no reason to adhere to it, you can find a way to break it. White's going to be more like, well, sometimes you don't understand why things are in place, and sometimes that's fine. Sometimes you just know that something is wrong, or you understand something is wrong, and you just shouldn't do it and don't think about it too hard. Um, Blue is a little more focused on constant improvement over the impact such decisions have on people. For example, blue is much more willing to allow people to fall through the cracks if the overall system is improved. Blue is trying to raise the ceiling, create the highest potential, while I am trying to focus on raising the floor, ensuring an absolute level of care for all. But we have shared goals. My biggest issue with blue is that blue spends far too much time caring about the individual, because blue is ally colors with black. And part of the reason blue is probably one of the most fascinating color pie placements to me in Magic is because white is the color that's all about improving like putting the improvement of society and other people above yourself, and black is all about putting the improvement of yourself over other people and society. So blue is like a sort of like middle. I believe we should improve everything as much as possible. Um, just as blue wants to optimize society, I want to optimize each member of that society. To do so, I will distribute things in a way that I think I will distribute things in ways that to do so, it will distribute things in a way that I think is unfair. If a person shows potential at a certain skill, blue gives them access to more resources to meet that potential. That comes at the expense of someone else, which can undercut my ultimate goal of ensuring everyone's needs are met. So, white believes in fairness. So, I think Mark has used this example where like white's more like leans more into like democracy, for example, where direct democracy where in theory everyone has equal say in who gets elected or who's in power or what happens with society, right? But blue is more like a meritocracy, where blue is more like if you don't know what you're talking about, I don't see why you should have a say in what's happening. um so yeah, so no more lies. One white, one blue, instant target, counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. If that spell is countered this way, exile instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. Lies fester and flourish in the shadow. Our job is to bathe them in light. Ezram, Agency Chief. So once again, we have that emphasis on like white and blue both caring about truth. But white usually cares about truth for more reasons, and blue is more about like trying to understand what's happening and to improve society and to improve things. And we have that sort of counterspell because white gets taxing effects, and then blue gets counterspells. So it's like a combination of a taxing effect and a counterspell. Although blue also just gets like taxing counterspells. Lavinia is always renegade. One white, one blue. Legendary creature, human soldier. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with mana value greater than the number of lands that player controls. So once again, that's a big emphasis on like how white cares about fairness and rules. So in Magic, like you might have ways of cheating out certain spells before you can actually have the lands to cast them. But here's white forcing you to like kind of adhere by the rules. White and blue forcing you to adhere to those rules. So you can't. So you have to cast things like the proper way, which is with lands. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana is spent to cast it, counter that spell. So once again, that's a bit of like blue. Blue has like a lot of counter spells and like hexproof and stuff because it's the idea that blue cares about knowledge, and since Magic is a game about playing as a wizard, if you're a blue wizard, you're more likely to have studied and researched and understand this magic to like a T, and thus you can more easily like counter it and stop people from casting it and stuff like that. So there's also a little bit of that. I told Jace that Ravnica would fall apart if he didn't take his responsibility seriously. I didn't want to be right. Nico, Light of Hope. Nico's one of my favorite characters because like the blue in their arc is actually very interesting. Like the idea that they were destined by Klothys to be something, and they said, "I don't want." And they basically made their own call and wanted to have free will, and they managed to break free from that. So that's a very blue thing to me. Very blue story. And one thing you will see in blue is like this theme of destiny, but I think people conflate why blue has that with like why colors like green have that. In the case of blue and black, cards with like that refer to destiny in blue and black is like the idea that that you can control destiny and have a say over what it is. And colors like green, it mentions destiny in the idea that there are certain things you cannot change or should not change. Um, Legendary creature, human wizard. When Nico Light of Hope enters, create 2 shard tokens. They're enchantments with 2 generic, sacrifice this enchantment, scry 1, then draw a card. So that's a lot, but caring about enchantments like white and then scrying. To be fair, white can scry 1 and then to draw a card. But, you know, it's both. 2 generic, tap. Exile target non-legendary creature you control. Cards you control become copies of it until the beginning of the next step. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of your next end step. So a bit of flickering. Sphinx's Revelation. 2 generic, 1 white, 2 blue. Instant. You gain X life and draw X cards. Let the knowledge of an absolute law inspire you to live a life of absolute order. So here we have that idea of like knowledge and understanding, but also combined with like white sort of law and order. Voyage Home. 5 generic, 1 white, 1 blue. Affinity for artifacts. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. You draw 3 cards and gain 3 life. So just combining blue, caring about knowledge and drawing cards, and then white life gain. Observation. At current rate of travel, eventual rediscovery of home is a mathematical inevitability. Firm imperative, let's go. So one thing also that you got to consider, because blue is between white and black, that when it allies with certain colors or is in certain color combinations, it can pull it in certain directions. So, like I said, blue cares about like raising the ceiling and improving everything as much as possible. Because blue believes in improving the individual, but also believes that in order to be the best individual you can be, you need to improve society and the systems at play that can feed you knowledge and the skills you need to thrive. So when you have like blue white, one way it can manifest is this idea of like prioritizing improving society in all the ways possible. There's also like a bit of I'm trying to think. I probably wrote about it, like blue and white, like some examples. I mean, there's like an emphasis on law, obviously, like getting people to behave in certain ways. But hold on. They both have a desire to make society a better place, logical and efficient. They're both enemy because of red. That's true, because red believes that like you should just follow your emotion and do what you want in the moment, because YOLO, and blue and white prefer like that you should put that. Blue and white make the distinction between what you want and what you need. Red, it's sort of red. It's like a bad rap of being stupid, but I don't think it's always true. And red can actually have like a very like well put together point, or even be not super emotional. It's just that its philosophy encourages you to be more emotional or lean into that emotion. So red believes that there is no distinction between what you want and what you need. And what red means by that is by what you want is an emotional need. Blue and white draw a distinction between what you want and what you need. Blue and white are like, what you want is not always what you need. So, and that's where they kind of conflict with red a little bit. It's like what you want right now is not what you need. Sometimes you have to give up what you want. With green, also white and blue, I guess both care a lot about artifacts. But with green, I share my love of community. We both understand the power of the group. The individuals can come together to make something stronger, something greater than themselves. Green realizes that no creature can be left behind, as each contributes to the larger picture, what green likes to call the web of life. Like me, green focuses on finding what role each creature plays in its connection to the larger ecosystem. Opposite from blue, green cares more about the moral side of things, although there is greater emphasis on spirituality than traditional religion. So, in the case of green, what white's getting at is that blue is going to be more questioning and need more of like a reason for why it shouldn't do something sometimes. Green is going to be, and it's not to say that white and green are stupid or never question anything. It's just that green and white are both going to argue that sometimes you don't necessarily need to know why something is being done. Sometimes you just need to understand that it is bad, and that's it. Sometimes. And in the case of the green, sometimes it's like, we shouldn't do this because this is unnatural and usurps nature. And that's all you need to know sometimes. And green also has like a less emphasis on structure in a way, because green cares about like, yes, it cares about the natural order, the food chain, stuff like that. And it cares about tradition, because tradition can help tell you what role things are supposed to play in the world. For example, green cares a lot about not forcing change, right? Green cares about letting things change naturally, and instead of trying to force things to change, accept things as they are. And part of accepting things as they are means understanding the role things have played in the past. For example, if you want to understand what role bears play in the ecosystem right now, you can look at like the records of their impact on the environment and why bears are important. And using that, you can understand, okay, this is the role bears play in the environment, and this is why bears are important. Now, the difference is that white cares more about changing the world a bit more than green, because white wants to improve the world. And green, so for example, like if white could make a world where people didn't die, it probably would. There was some way in doing it like morally correctly, green would be like death is a natural part of the world. And we probably shouldn't change that, right? Because the thing about, like I said, I spoke earlier, people think green's like this hippie, like, oh, make love not war, man, color, but like nature can be pretty brutal, and green is like sometimes you need to live with that. Sometimes people get eaten by a fucking lion, and sometimes you gotta live with that. Sometimes trying to save people will starve the lion, and so you shouldn't always try to save people. But white's always gonna be like, we can find a way to like save all these people and keep people from being eaten by lions, kind of thing. Um, Also, green does not use morality to educate or provide guidelines for what is acceptable behavior. Green's creatures rely more on instinct, filling a role that they were born into. Where Green and I most differ is the role of restraint. I believe that to have an orderly society, there have to be rules in place to keep people from acting on impulse. Green, in contrast, functions more on instinct. That is not an emotion per se, but is instead a way of acting on internal motivations that are not inherently driven by welfare of the group. In other words, Green has a wild side that scares me a little bit. So basically, what White is saying is sometimes Green is saying creatures have a certain role, and sometimes that role is just kind of look out for yourself, I guess, in a way. Like if you're hungry, you should eat because that's your natural calling, basically. And not that you should, like, maybe you should hold off on eating because, other people might need the food, but like, stuff like that. Green does have like lines though, obviously, like, one of the points Green makes in one of Mark's other articles is like, you eat because you're hungry. You don't just eat just to stuff your face, right? But at the same time, like, where Green and White draw the line is like different. This brings me to my two enemies. I will start with Red. Red is chaos personified. Red does whatever it wants to do without any thought of the repercussions. This is quite dangerous. I created laws to stop this kind of thing. Left to their own impulses, people left to their own impulses will do dangerous things. Some people will get hurt and others will die. For what? So that Red can just do whatever it wants to do? The insidious part is that Red makes it so enticing. Yes, there are limitations built into a system for the protection of its people. I get how that can feel restricting at times, but Red uses that frustration as justification to not have any responsibility for its actions. Oops, you died, Red says, but look at the giant fireball I made. I said before that recklessness is one of the two greatest threats to peace, and Red trumpets recklessness as a virtue. That is problematic and must be stopped with whatever tools we have at our disposal. The one thing I do admire about Red is that it seems to care about personal connections between people besides myself. Red is the magic color. Beside myself, Red is the magic color most capable of self-sacrifice to protect others. True, in Red's case, it has to be someone they have an emotional connection to, but it's admirable that Red can care so deeply about the needs of another, which is like the distinction between Red and Black. Black will say even if you have friends, you should always put yourself first. Red will say that you should do whatever you want, so if you want to sacrifice yourself for somebody else, go for it. But sometimes, so I already talked about like war, like soldiers a bit, and red white a little bit, but let's look into this. Aurelia the War Leader, 2 generic, 2 red, 2 white. Legendary creature, Angel, flying, vigilance, haste. Whenever Aurelia the War Leader attacks for the first time each turn, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Where Razia was aloof and untouchable, Aurelia is on the front lines calling for war. So here we have like some keywords. White gets like the flyers, like I said earlier. Vigilance, like the idea that it's like a defensive keyword, so you can swing in and still have enough to like defend yourself. And then haste, which is like more red, which is the idea of acting on impulse and emotion and pushing yourself to like go in as fast as possible. Boros Charm, 2 red, 1 not 2 red, 1 red, 1 white. Instant. Choose one. Boros Charm deals 4 damage to target player or planeswalker, so that's just a red effect. Permanents you control gain indestructible to the end of turn. That's a white effect, protecting things. Target creature gains double strike until the end of turn. So that's both a red and a white effect. Red and white both get first strike and double strike, although I would argue for different reasons. In the case of like white, first strike and double strike represent a sort of like either discipline and training, but also they can be used defensively to protect your creatures when they swing in or just defend you. So no one gets like as few people get hurt as possible. In the case of red, I think it's more just like represents impulse, like a sort of swing first, ask questions later. Like I'm not waiting to see what you do. I'm just swinging first and I'm gonna hurt you. Heroic reinforcements: 2 generic, 1 red, 1 white. Sorcery: create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. Until the end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain haste. Cries of Anguish quickly spurred cries of action. So once again, there's kind of like a theme here of like how red and white both overlap in the idea that sometimes you should just do what you feel is right or know is right, and so sometimes what you feel is right can be the moral thing, and that's like where red and white can overlap. But also red and white can both have ways of going wide. They both make like a lot of small tokens generally. Black tends to make fewer but like bigger tokens, like 2/2s. Blue also makes small tokens but not as many, and then green can make all kinds of weird tokens, but um, it also protects them by giving them +1/+1 and gives them haste. Quintorius Khan, 3 generic, 1 red, 1 white. Legendary Planeswalker Quintorius. So actually so he's from I'm trying to remember, Lorehold from the Strixhaven, and I could write like a whole different article on how the specific colleges on Strixhaven manifest the different colors and color conflicts. Like for example, in Quandrix, the idea of that is that blue green are in conflict there because it's blue's idea that math is a construct that we invented and used to explain the world, and green believes that math already exists in nature and we're just sort of uncovering it and coming up with explanations for how to put it in a language we understand. Silver Quill is like white and black. It's the idea that should we use language to make the world a better place, or do we use language to better prioritize ourselves? Like, language can be used to uplift people and help the downtrodden and focus on doing the right thing, but language can also be used to get people to do what you want and also put yourself in positions of power. In the case of Prismari, blue and red, blue is the idea of using art, taking art as like a form of perfection and being very, very like mindful about it and making like very technically correct techniques and putting your mind first when making art. And red is more about art as like an emotional, personal form of expression, of using art as just like in a more emotional way and just acting on more an impulse. And of course they have the combinations like blue and red, like blue and red on Prismari, like the idea of doing both, like using both your mind and forethought, but also tapping into your emotion and acting like on a whim sometimes. But in the case of Laurel, it's a bit more complicated because it's more like the idea of order and chaos within the context of history. In this case, in the case of Lorehold, it's White's idea that people are acting like with certain patterns and certain structures, and they're behaving based on that. And because of that, history is like an identifiable pattern, and like that can be understood. And Red's idea that people are very impulsive, people are inherently emotional, and because of that, Red's arguing that history is inherently chaotic. People don't always do like the most reasonable things. People just act on their emotion or their gut, and that spirals off and creates entire like massive events and wars and all kinds of weird stuff. Also, sometimes the Red archaeologists are portrayed as like sort of Indiana Jones type characters. But anyway, Legendary Planeswalker Quintorius. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, Quintorius Khan deals 2 damage to each opponent and you gain 2 life. So red can exile cards that you can cast from your library. Like it exiles them till end of turn usually, or till the end of your next turn, and then you can deal 2 damage and gain 2 life, which is like red dealing damage and white gaining you life. Create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. Discover 4. I think Discover, I don't remember. We don't need to worry about what Discover does at this moment. And exile any number of -6. Exile any number of target cards from your graveyard. Add 1 red for each card exiled this way. You've been playing those cards this turn. So one thing red gets too is like a lot of like mana creation. But unlike green, it tends to be like more impulsive and temporary. Where like green will create like things it can tap repeatedly over time, and red will be like tap like. Well, red will be like sacrifice this treasure to create 1 mana that you can spend immediately, or else it goes away. Or red will create like 6 red mana, but it'll go away if you don't spend it this turn. And that just leads into the idea of red wanting to live in the moment, of being impulsive. The idea that red's like you should do what you want to do now. So red is punishing you for trying to wait to spend your mana sometimes. It's the idea that red's trying to get you to play a certain way. When Noda joined our forces, 2 generic, 1 red, 1 white. Also, I didn't know my Steam thing showed up. Legendary creature, Human Warrior. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. Put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So when Noda's join of forces, so I think this represents the bonds between like creature and people. So like the idea of like, because she's from Ikoria where they have like bonders who can bond with creatures. So the idea is that I guess it's like a very emotional red bond, but also like organizing them with like White's idea of structure. And you can like put them on the battlefield, and they can be attacking because you're using like the red emotion to have them attack immediately, but also protecting them with like white indestructible. Which brings us to black, the champion of selfishness. Black treats immorality like a trophy, something to be proud of. Recklessness is dangerous, but at least that is not on purpose. Black thinks of violence, disease, and cruelty as tools, things it can use to get what it wants. So from White's perspective, black can often be immoral, but from black's perspective, it's amoral in the sense that black does not believe there is an objective morality, and thus you should do whatever it takes to to win or stay ahead or stay alive or get what you need or slash one. Nothing is taboo to Black. It will do whatever it needs to get what it wants, no matter who it hurts in the process. In fact, Black seems to revel in causing others pain. Their end goal is a dystopia, a world where most suffer at so a few can thrive. It is the exact opposite of what we are working toward. What makes this so dangerous is that each person has desires to prioritize themselves. I have to create elaborate systems to educate people, while Black feeds their worst impulses. And Black can start small. It is so easy to get someone to make a tiny selfish gesture. And once they are comfortable with that, you just keep slightly raising the stakes. It's a slippery slope. I mean, the point of that's usually a fallacy, but one that can lead to doing horrible things you will later regret when it's too late to do anything about it. Interestingly, Black has come to respect the power of systems. Black saw how I was using religion and law and has created its own forms of it. However, they can still be effective in educating and motivating people. So one thing Black and White also overlap on is like kind of like sacrifice. Within Magic, both colors are really good at sacrificing either themselves or other things. In the case of White, the flavor is usually that a white creature is sacrificing itself for the good of the group or to win the battle. In the case of Black, it's usually like the flavor of sacrificing other people to get to win the battle. And this creates like, a potential relationship where it's like someone who's willing to sacrifice, like Black is willing to take advantage. You have someone who's like, for example, maybe Black line and someone who's maybe white line. Black is like, I'm willing to sacrifice you in a heartbeat to win the battle. And the white line person's like, great. That's what needs to be done. So there is like a theme of like sacrifice, not always so parasitic, but like the idea that they're both of these are colors that understand the importance of sacrifice and that sometimes you have to sacrifice things or give things up in order for a bigger goal. Which is kind of reflected a bit in their mechanics and how they can both sacrifice a ton of things to get different effects. But yes, so also another thing to consider is that Black. So this idea that Black is like a lone wolf and that Black like is saying you shouldn't have any friends or work with people. Black at the end of the day is just saying you should look out for yourself first and foremost. So Black is totally fine with working with other people and teaming up with other people to get the job done. So Black and White can overlap in that regards, and that Black is willing to like sometimes work with other people to get the job done, or Black sometimes understands the importance that working in a group sometimes lets you do things that you could never ever do on your own. And one thing Black and White can both care about is like creatures dying, where it's like if something dies, then it rallies you to a cause, or it acts as a form of sacrifice, so for the greater good, or for your end goal, or whatever. Dire Tactic, which is like exile target creature, and then you sacrifice, or you lose life, or you lose life or something. So, yeah. And Black does sometimes go like into overwhelming numbers. Like for example, zombies are usually just a bunch of 2/2s that just go in and kick the shit out of you. And there is like a form of like White and Black that's sort of like White's goals of like peace through structure, and then Black's like power through opportunity. So you can end up with a character who's like the White goal of like I want peace, then Black's structure of like, or Black's goal of like Black's method of use any methods possible to get the job done. So there is like a sort of ends justify the means that you can get with like White and Black sometimes. Like sometimes you gotta make a sacrifice for the greater good, even if that means like doing something bad now, but. Which brings me to my strengths and weaknesses. Mr. Rosewater likes to say those are each an extension of each other. I have embraced order as a powerful tool. It helps me shape environments and gives me access to more answers to different threats than any other color of Magic. Given the time to plot and plan, I can solve most problems. The downside of that is each of my answers is prescriptive. That is to say, it is tailored to a certain problem. So if a different threat shows up, one I was not prepared for, I do not have the flexibility to adapt quickly. I can often get caught off guard if I do not properly anticipate what was coming. Another one of my strengths is my morality. I know right from wrong and can act accordingly. When I lay my head down at night, I can do so without regret, knowing that I held myself to the highest standard. Part of that is that there are things I refuse to do. For example, I will not kill unless it is absolutely necessary. I choose instead to imprison my foes, but that means there are times when they escape and undo my work. That does not happen to other colors of Magic, like Black, who make sure to permanently remove any threat. But I understand living correctly sometimes comes at a cost. I cannot win the day if I do not do it honorably. So Mono White basically saying that the ends do not justify the means, right? White on its own is saying that you have to do things a certain way if you want it done right. Black is basically saying whatever it takes to win, on its own at least. And then White Black can manifest as like weird ways where it's like a combination of the two. Each time you justify doing something you know you should not, you're taking a step away from utopia instead of toward it. I get what I am asking for is difficult. Doing the right thing is way harder than doing the easy thing. But what I have to offer is important. We as a society have the chance to think bigger, to be better. we do not have to accept the world as it is. So this is again where white and green might differ, and where white and blue agree, where it's like you do not have to accept the world for as it is. You can build a better world if we work together. We can dream of a world free of suffering. And once again, another disagreement between white and green is that green believes you can overcome suffering in a way by accepting the world for as it is, but sometimes suffering is just kind of like a part of life you can't change, right? And white and blue are both colors that believe that you can change it so you're not suffering, or people don't suffer as often. We have the power to improve our lives if we just have the courage and conviction to do so. And so we have Ajani, Strength of the Pride, 2 generic, 2 white. This is a lot of text. Do I want to read all this? I mean, this is such an iconic card. Okay, so legendary Planeswalker Ajani. You gain life equal to the number of creatures you control, plus the number of Planeswalkers you control. Create a 2/2 white cat soldier creature token named Ajani's Pridemate. With whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter Ajani's Pridemate. So just caring about life and going wide and making tokens. And also gaining life and getting life. If you have at least 15 life, more than your starting total, exile Ajani, Strength of the Pride, and each artifact and creature your opponent controls. So just rewarding you for having a bunch of life. Skillful Lunge. 1 generic, 1 white. Instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 against first strike until the end of turn. So just first strike again. Valor is a currency of the living that serves us well. Cost per low of the Silburn Guard. Strength of Arms. 1 white. Instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If you control an equipment, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. We fight not for Avacyn, but for her ideals. Not for the church, but for its people. Dahlia Garden of Thraben. So that's one thing that also white emphasizes, is like fighting for ideals and stuff. And that's where white and black can also conflict sometimes, because black is all about appealing to the individual, and black also wants to like have as much like say over what happens to it as possible, which can mean consolidating a lot of power to itself. And this can create a sort of like weak point sometimes in how it organizes groups, right? Where because black wants to have the power and the say to do what it wants, it's going to consolidate power, and that means if you destroy whoever's in charge, the group is more likely to fall apart. But white kind of spreads out a bit more most of the time, where yes, white can have kings and stuff, but white emphasizes also like fighting for like the ideals and the good of the group and like morals and things that even if you take out the leader, that the group may not immediately collapse because of that. Although to be fair to black, also black is at the end of the day just wants to have control over over its life and over its like what the individual has say over. And that doesn't always mean like conquering the entire world. I think it's like this idea that every black character secretly wants to conquer the entire world, and that can be a very black line thing to do if they think it gets them what they need or want. But it could just be as easily as a black character who just wants enough power to, you know, have control over the life, have their say over the life, do what they want to do. Smile at Death. 3 generic, 2 white. Enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, return up to 2 target creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a +1/+1 counter on each of those creatures. Khan, Alesha, and ensure their survival. Now we will forge our future. Zurgo, Khan of Mardu. So, just returning. So black and white also overlap, and they can both return creatures from the graveyard. Black usually do so with less restraints because it's the idea that it's less likely to shy away from like desecrating the dead or breaking moral codes to get to do that. White is usually more restricted. Is the idea that it can bring something back that died this turn, or something that's like small enough, like a bunch of small creatures. And the idea with white is usually that it's saving them from death as opposed to like resurrecting them. But similar overlap. Take up the shield. 1 generic, 1 white. Instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. So +1/+1 counter to help, indestructible for protection, lifelink to help. You are all part of my pride. As long as I live, I will protect you. And so here you have like a bit of flavor here, where it's like Ajani protecting them, and the card in essence helps protect you because it's protecting the creature, yes, but also has lifelink, and that lifelink also helps heal you. So I hope it recorded all that time. I'm gonna go mad if I do this a third time. Let me just double check. Okay, I think, for the love of God, I think that's all. So I don't plan to stream consistently on Sundays at the moment, but I just did it now because I felt really bad because I did not realize that the audio just did not take, and I was sharing that video around, and I guess people were really confused. So on that note, thanks for watching, even if it was for a very short amount of time. If you saw my last video, I apologize about that. Here's the new one up so you can listen to the full audio. Sorry if I talked a little bit more fast. I was trying to get through it faster because I already went over it, but I try to control myself. I'll see you guys later.